Welcome back to our panel discussion, Reducing Risk in the Cloud for Government, sponsored by Microsoft, here on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. Our guests today are Melinda Rogers, the Chief Information Security Officer of the Justice Department, Gary Bartlett, the Chief Information Officer of the U.S. Postal Service Office of Inspector General. Steve Hernandez is the Chief Information Security Officer for Health and Human Services, Inspector General Office, and Mark Williams, the Chief Security Officer at Microsoft Federal. And I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. In this segment, I want to talk about levels of classification of data. We're going to stay away from classified because that's a whole different SIPRNet question, and we're not going to go there. But even within unclassified data, agencies have different levels of sensitivity and so on. And so I guess the question is, FedRAMP, how high in the level of sensitivity can it go? And what do you need? What's your answer, if you have one, or solution for going higher than that, and you want cloud? What are agencies thinking about? Steve?
Sure. So in the federal space, we use Federal Information Processing Standard 199 to categorize our data, and we categorize it by impact level, low, moderate, or high. FedRAMP right now is designed to handle moderate and low impact systems. And so as long as your agency is only dealing with data that fits within those categories, a single cloud provider is probably going to be sufficient for your needs. However, the moment you have a single bit of data that wanders into that high impact area, that can be problematic for you, because a cloud provider innately through the FedRAMP process can't meet that requirement, that minimum baseline. And so what as an agency you're stuck doing is figuring out, okay, do I continue to host this on-prem and in some cases have duplication of my services, or do I try to go out and find a cloud provider that can meet the NIST high impact even though they don't meet FedRAMP? And neither case is particularly easy.
No, are there people that meet the NIST that also have FedRAMP, or that doesn't happen?
In some cases it does. So you do have some outsourcing providers that can meet that FIPS 199 high level, and they're going to be treated as a cloud provider, but the issue is there's no way to actually certify them through the FedRAMP process right now. So you would go through a traditional, they're an outsourced contractor review process, do a FISMA certification and accreditation activity upon them, or assessment and authorization as we call it now, and then actually take that residual risk and bring it back in for your authorizing official to sign off on.
But any other agency that wanted to do the same thing would have to go through the same process for that. So that's the opposite of the way FedRAMP works. All right, so give us an example of, say, at HHS, what might be high sensitivity data that doesn't reach the classified, if you have classified. But what would be high, what would be moderate, what would be low? Give us some examples.
Sure. So anything that deals with like loss of human life. And so if we have research related to, say, the Ebola virus or something like that, sensitive information where it could cause a catastrophic impact to the government or loss of human life, something like that, that would rise up to that level. In some cases, it might be the secretary's schedule where she's going to be at certain times, especially if there's some hot topic items about in the news. But anything dealing with life or catastrophic impact to the government.
Okay, and Gary, at the Office of Inspector General, is everything high? Apparently not, because you do some cloud work.
No, and everything's not high, and it gets into, as Stephen was just talking about, the way it's categorized. So we've got different levels of information. With us, probably our most sensitive thing is our case management when it comes to our law enforcement aspect, and the things that we do. Some of our auditing falls into a little bit of concern because of the impact it could have on postal and the sensitivity of that information. But really, our biggest concern is our law enforcement data. As I mentioned earlier, we had entertained the thought of looking at a external provider to host a new case management system, and just decided based on the risk, based on some of the cost, honestly, that was going to go into it, because that's another thing that happens. The second you deviate from the traditional FedRAMP process and go into something higher, here come the dollars, right? I mean, that's the cost goes significantly higher when you get into that high level of kind of protection levels that you need. So that impacts all the decisions, and those are things that you just have to sit down and weigh, the pros and cons of everything, and sometimes the answer is, as much as I hate to do it, I'm going to keep it in-house.
All right, so Melinda, Justice, of course, clearly has a lot of instances of high sensitivity data, considering all of the component agencies that are there. But so if you have email in a lower medium, can you send an important document that might be high through the email that's in the low cloud or the medium cloud? Just thought I wondered about that.
It's a very timely topic for us. We are actually performing a thorough assessment of all of our various email systems from within the Department of Justice to figure out what that right classification level is, because we do have different components. Some are law enforcement components,
prosecutors, yeah.
exactly, and prosecutors. So that
Or FBI.
so that we're sorting that out. But in the meantime, at least within the Department of Justice, yes, we do have a number of FIPS high systems, but we also have a lot more moderates and lows, and that's actually where we're focusing our energy on, is to figure out, especially with the lows, the low-hanging fruit, literally, what can we do to outsource that, to get that economy of scale, get the cost savings from that, and also get some lessons learned, right? So this is not perfection. This is still developing. Let's get some success stories, and then take that information, take the lessons learned, apply to the moderates, and then at some point the highs will get there when it gets there.
And what about like Microsoft Active Directory, which I guess you could say, given the information that's in there, would be fairly high-level sensitive because it has a lot of personal information, but yet in an email cloud-providing system, that's where your directory is. So, Mark, how does that all work?
It's not necessarily, your directory is not necessarily in the cloud.
not, okay.
You can leave your directory on-premise and populate certain data points into the cloud, but
see.
you don't have to be in the cloud.
So that can be separated.
Yes. Another point about the low, moderate, and high is that they correspond to a baseline that is the minimum set of security controls. People tend to default to that high because they need that highest category. For the edge case, someone might send something, or someone is using the email system to share, really sensitive information, which is probably not the best way to do that. So you can actually look at the baselines and really look at what you're using the system for, and then you can tailor the baseline. If there are certain controls you need above and beyond that moderate baseline, you can include those in a moderate package without going to a high-impact system.
So by calibrating your real requirements, you can avoid some of that high cost that Gary mentioned that
Exactly.
goes with the high.
Yes.
So you wouldn't want to buy a Ferrari on the assumption you might get the Beltway all to yourself someday. I guess this would be a good way
That's
to look
exactly the point.
at it. Well, that doesn't stop some people around here. And I'm curious, too, Mark, what are some of the commercial customer best practices that you see where they also have the same deal? There's some low-level sensitivity and high-level sensitivity data.
They generally fall with a more of a commercial categorization, so high impact and moderate impact, low impact, but it's all business data, so it's the impact to the business. If certain soft drink makers' formula is the golden key to their world, so they have different requirements based on that. What we do
I thought that was on a single piece of paper in a vault somewhere.
somewhere safe. As a corporation, since we serve all over the world, our services are worldwide, governments, commercial. We have a single set of requirements that we map to across the globe, and it doesn't matter if you're a commercial customer or a government customer, you're getting the same level of security because we can't do one-offs in the same service brand.
Sure. Okay, well, interesting. And then when we're talking about security, we should talk about an application here. And I wanted to ask you about this. Sometimes people other than your agency need access to information. There's e-discovery, auditors, maybe even those IGs, want to look in the other part of the agency. Not that that ever happens. So what are some of the concerns, Steve, with respect to third-party access, which may be legally required?
Sure. So one area that we run into time to time is a requirement for jurisdiction. And basically that means, are we in a country or a territory where we can fully execute a warrant or a search or a subpoena? If we're not on U.S. soil, that becomes very hard to do from the IG perspective. And so, one, we have jurisdictional issues we have to look at, and FedRAMP doesn't necessarily go in and flat out say, all your data must stay on U.S. soil. So agencies need to be aware of that when they may need to actually execute a search warrant or even come in for inspection.
So you're talking about if from the United States you would need to discover something where the physical location of the data is not in the United States.
Right. So if your data physically resides in another country, you have two issues. One, you don't have native jurisdiction over the data to execute a search warrant or something similar. And then two, you're now dealing with another government to get access to that data if you need it. And so it becomes very complex and can be a real challenge. Additionally, we have a situation where in the past we had a lot of physical limitations and funding limitations on what we could actually store in terms of, say, a litigation hold. And we would say, well, we can store up to 7 terabytes, and then it just becomes enormously cost prohibitive. And the attorneys and the judges would say that seems reasonable, we're okay. Now that we're in the cloud, and the cloud just expands to meet our requirement, those arguments are no longer holding water, because we can literally retain everything indefinitely. And so we've had to go back to our legal teams and say, okay, guys, we have the records retention schedules, but we need to look at the life cycle of the information and try to figure out who needs to retain what and for how long and for what purpose, and then when do we start destroying information. And that's a tough argument that's going on in several agencies right now.
Because ultimately, you don't want to keep everything forever, even if you can, right?
That's right. Absolutely not.
All right, yeah, Mark, how does that affect a cloud provider if someone says, well, now I can go from 7 to 70 or 700 terabytes or exabyte or whatever it is? I mean, that must have some
Disk is
service.
cheap.
Optical is even cheaper.
Yes.
But, you know, it would take you 5 weeks to retrieve it. But what about the cost and other, you know, service agreement provisions that might come into play with something getting that big and that deep?
So each of your service offerings have a package that you buy into, and that defines how much your storage is, and that can go up to an unlimited storage, and that's calculated into the price so we can keep scale with estimated usage.
All right, and then there's also the issue of what the cloud provider has to do to keep migrating that to different physical hardware over time.
Yes.
And is that something that's visible to the customer? If
It's all transparent to the customer, but it does happen behind, we do it in the background. The customer should never feel the impact of that. Much like you were saying a minute ago about, location of data. If you're geographically not in the United States, that goes back to our transparency discussion. To us, customers need to know where their data is at all times. So we publish that in our trust centers. You know exactly which data centers your data resides in.
All right, Melinda, at Justice, what are some of the implications for discovery and legal litigation and all that as it concerned with cloud and security topics?
Sure. For us, I mean, what we really try to focus on is what's in the service level agreement. So, for example, I think you mentioned earlier giving our OIG office within Justice Department access to inspect or evaluate our cloud service providers' performance. That's key, and that's something that we, over our experiences, we've had to proactively negotiate with the cloud service providers, because, again, it's a little bit of intrusiveness into the cloud service provider to say, here, we want you to open your books completely. But it's a partnership, it's a process, and I'd say we've done well so far, and what we want to do is continue down that path, and more importantly, I forget which one of my fellow panelists mentioned the ability to access potentially investigative information, forensic analysis. So if there were a breach, or even before a breach, anywhere on the continuum, we have to be able to come in and conduct the necessary due diligence to figure out if there is an incident here or not. And if there were an incident, if it were criminal, we have to be able to allow our law enforcement partners to be able to come in and take action.
All right. So, yeah, Gary, you have the same issue, being an IG office, access to your own stuff, plus the IG access to what's elsewhere in the agency. Well, how does that all work?
Absolutely, and some of the same challenges that Melinda talked about is making sure that, number one, those things are baked into contracts, right? Baked into the agreements that says, hey, it's not just Bob in my IT shop that's allowed to access this data, but there may be external people that have to come in and get access to this data. And honestly, part of that challenge is sometimes we have to do that without the agency knowing that we're doing that, right? Sometimes there are requirements for us to be very careful about who knows what we're doing. That's part of the reason of having a separate IG, to begin with. So sometimes that can be a challenge as we start to go, digging for that data, and sometimes that forces us down the path of having to go get a warrant, having to go get, legal paperwork that says we're going to come in and get this, and no, you don't get to pick up the phone and call the customer to tell them that we're coming in to get this. So that can be, that's just a challenge that, as we move into this world. We've had to do that with the local 7-Eleven sometimes to get surveillance photos or things like that. Now it's dealing with cloud providers in much the same way sometimes.
Another good question to ask your cloud provider is what type of native e-discovery support do they offer? Okay, because if they say, well, we'll just give you blobs of data, well, that's going to be taxing on your network, or it's going to be taxing on your FedEx guy, and you're still going to have to maintain a fairly complex suite of tools in your own agency to do the e-discovery function, and that's very problematic. So when you go and look at your cloud provider, and this is, again, not something that's inherent in FedRAMP, you have to look a little bit beyond that. You have to say, hey, what type of e-discovery capability do you provide natively for me to search and ferret out information as much as I can on that cloud platform, and then bring back the cream that I really need into my organization?
All right, so I've been covering this cloud issue for a long time, and hearing the discussion today, I get the sense that there are many, many issues, but one by one, the providers and the agencies are knocking them down. So I'm hearing different questions than we heard a year ago and 2 years ago, even 5 years ago, when this all kind of burst on the scene. So in the couple of minutes we have left, I'd like to just go right down the table and just give us the idea of what you would like to see happen in the next year to 18 months with respect to security and safety and assurance in the cloud computing. Gary, we'll start with you.
So again, I think it goes back to just continuing that relationship building, continuing that transparency, continuing those partnerships, where that we all know that we have to work together in order to really get this to the fruition that we really all want it to be, and understanding that it's going to be an evolution. We're never going to be done with this. There's always going to be changes. So I think it's just that partnership and that transparency and just continuing down this path.
Okay, Melinda, with respect to the risk theme, and there's a lot of aspects to risk, and risk
Absolutely.
management is the most popular word right now in the federal government.
Yes.
So how does risk management work in the cloud? What would you like to see ahead?
So I think at the end of the day, there are a lot of virtues of outsourcing services or solutions out to the cloud, but I would say it's incumbent upon each department and agency to advocate for their agency. You got to negotiate good business terms. This is not unlike any other business deal that one would do in the private sector. You got to negotiate. You got to push hard. If the cloud service provider can't agree to it, they will tell you they can't do it, but we got to go for it so that at the end of the day, both sides can come out with a winning proposition. The cloud service provider gets a marquee client, and the government agency gets the best-in-class solution.
And there was a recent collapse of a cloud provider that kind of left that agency in the lurch. So are you looking at business stability too now as something for a cloud provider to have?
Absolutely. Continuity of operation, disaster. I mean, all the sort of the basics. It is actually, at the end of the day, it is back to basics. You need to have the basic asset management procedures in place. You need to have business continuity plans in place. And business terms. Does it make business sense? Yes, cloud services can be the lesser cost option, but if you strip out all the security elements, it'll be really cheap. So what does that end price look like when it's an efficient solution that has the right security requirements in place?
And Steve, you've got about 20 seconds.
I'll be quick. We're all talking about getting into the cloud and how wonderful it is. What we're not talking about is how to move from one cloud provider to another, or data portability. And I think that's going to be a real challenge, where I'm with cloud provider A today and things are wonderful, but 2 years down the road, cloud provider X is awesome and I want to be there. How do I move, and can I do that with my current contract? I think that's going to catch a lot of folks.
Okay, and Mark, we'll give you the final word on risk management and risk assessment and risk mitigation. What's ahead?
Well, we need to continue communicating and building the relationship. Microsoft is committed to transparency, trustworthiness. We need to prove to our customer that we are a trustworthy steward for their data, and that's what we intend to do.
All right, I want to thank today's guests. Gary Bartlett is the Chief Information Officer at the Postal Service Inspector General. Melinda Rogers, Chief Information Security Officer of the Justice Department. Steve Hernandez, Chief Information Security Officer for the Health and Human Services Inspector General. And Mark Williams, the Chief Security Officer at Microsoft Federal. I'm Tom Temin, Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com.
On behalf of Microsoft, thank you for joining us for this discussion. We'll have the archive from this session available shortly, and a link will be sent to you to share with your colleagues. Those of you who requested a training certificate should receive it in the next 2 weeks. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you.